An enormous cupboard about 5 meters long and 3 meters high stored Hitler's record collection and other private possessions. Although this room was really the finest at Berchtesgaden, the official house guests preferred the rustic, simply furnished living room of the former Haus Wachenfeld. This cosy room was separated from the hall by a heavy curtain. A green glazed stove warmed in winter and cooled in summer those on the surrounding seating. The restrooms for Hitler's personal staff and adjutants were on the ground floor. Further on were located laundry rooms and a large kitchen near the dining room. Hitler's small private area was on the first floor. The rooms for guests, the staff, the adjutants and the housekeepers were also there. One of the guest rooms with bathroom was separated from Hitler's suite only by a space between doors. Inside this wing, one could therefore pass from room to room without having to go into the corridor. Eva Braun lived in this particular guest room. Why would the female housekeeper at the Berghof, Eva, having been introduced to us as such, have this special access to Hitler's sleeping quarters? One soon had one's own ideas about this. On the second floor were more guest rooms. The female secretaries and some women of the house staff also lodged there. Below, in the cellar, Hitler had had a bowling alley built. The fact that he liked to bowl he kept to himself. This passion did not seem to him to be fitting for a great statesman, and he was concerned that all the bowling clubs of the Reich, should they discover his predilection, would make him honorary chairman. To these nether regions of the house, Eva would often resort with female friends or the secretaries to watch films, if Hitler had an official visit, and her presence was therefore not required. A large number of valuable paintings were scattered about the walls of the whole house. They belonged to Hitler, and I heard that he wanted to exhibit them one day at Linz in a specially designed museum, the Führer Museum. We of the SS bodyguard were not given quarters in the main house, but in a wooden annex about 20 meters long. We reached our service rooms by an open balcony on the valley side, which was always beautifully arranged with tubs of flowers. The commandant of the bodyguard had his room in this annex, and the secretaries worked there too. The washing facilities were located hereabouts. Close to us was the dental surgery. Professor Hugo Blaschke, an elderly-looking gentleman, was not only Hitler's private dental surgeon, but he also treated many other people in the closer circle of the boss. From our veranda we could see in the distance the Hohensalzburg fortress on a hilltop. Below in the valley was Berchtesgaden. The annex balcony also gave an unfettered view of the Berghof terrace, on which the numerous get-togethers and receptions were played out. Here I had a grandstand view of world history, or of Eva lounging on a sunbed. The mood on the Obersalzberg was always unforced. The war would not be passing by this way. Even many high-ranking representatives of non-Allied states seemed to forget the war completely when at the Berghof. I remember the visit of a US envoy with whom Hitler was chatting in the best of moods. It even continued when Hitler casually handed him a note, which the envoy equally casually tucked into a pocket. My colleague was of the opinion that the note had something to do with the entry of the United States into the war. In any case, the two of them went on with their free and easy conversation, Hitler describing the region with alluring gestures. Built onto our wooden annex was another small two-story building. The upper floor was occupied for most of the time by Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, Colonel Nicholas von Below, whom I remember as a very pleasant man. Additional to the Berghof plot of land, which belonged to Hitler personally, and for which he had paid with the royalties from Mein Kampf, Martin Bormann had bought in trust for the NSDAP other parcels on which he had erected new structures or torn down the existing ones. Over the course of time, nearly everybody in the leadership had a domicile on the Obersalzberg: Göring, Speer, Hitler's deputy in the party, Rudolf Hess Six, and many others. By 1943, almost the whole of the Obersalzberg was the property of the NSDAP. In 1933, Bormann had bought the inn Zum Türken, which was situated above Haus Wachenfeld. Even the Platterhof, a former farm, belonged to the NSDAP and was converted into a hotel. It had a multi-purpose hall with about 2,000 seats and was used by Hitler from time to time to deliver a speech. Generally on these occasions, contrary to the practice in Berlin or Munich, I would be in the hall. In any case, Obersalzberg was a long-term building site. Duty in a holiday camp atmosphere. I enjoyed the time at the Berghof very much because my colleagues and I had very little to do. There was a permanent telephonist who only seldom needed assistance. There were only 6 of us of the SS bodyguard present. More beds than that stood empty. On the Obersalzberg, therefore, I spent much more of my time as a bodyguard. State receptions were held in the small Baroque palace Klesheim near Salzburg. From 1942, the castle served as a guest house, and I remember it particularly for a special outbreak of rage by Hitler. Apart from one other instance, this was actually the only time that I saw him infuriated. Otherwise, I never witnessed him shouting wildly. When consorting with the generals, he could not let himself go in that way, and he would pull himself together. It was at Schloss Klesheim that I saw him almost raging. He had a meeting with the Hungarian envoy, Admiral Nicholas von Horthy, and I could hear from outside the door of the room in which the conversation took place, the loud tones in which it was being conducted. Suddenly they both emerged, not so much as looking at each other, Horthy going one way, Hitler the other. At the Berghof, there was at least one military situation conference daily, and there were also numerous receptions. Many guests were present almost constantly. Eva Braun, personal physician Theo Morell and his wife Hannelore, Sepp Dietrich, Margaret and Albert Speer, photographer Heinrich Hoffmann and his second wife Erna, State Secretary Hermann Esser, medical officers Hans Karl von Hasselbach and Karl Brandt, and others. It was almost a family environment, with grown-ups sunning themselves, children running around madly, and between them yapping dogs. My time at the Berghof was for me the finest. The daily programme was laid down a day beforehand, but which colleague did what was of little interest to our commander. The splitting up of the work was more or less left to ourselves. The main thing was to have somebody responsible for each task. Thus, one could change jobs at will with a colleague to suit some objective one had in mind, or work a longer shift so as to have a shorter one owed for another occasion. Even on duty, however, the Berghof was like a hotel to us. It was just like being on holiday. We could even take what photos we liked with our own cameras. To capture Hitler and his guests through the lens of my Retina 11 was possible. Only during official visits to the Berghof would the photographs taken that day have to be submitted to Heinrich Hoffmann. This was just a formality, however. At the time, I did not understand the significance of it. I took a photo of Hitler with his hands in his trouser pockets. That it was somehow unusual never occurred to me, so I just clicked the shutter whenever I wanted, without really considering what might be of interest to the world afterwards. Hoffmann also gave me the prototype of a technically improved colour film for testing. I used it to take the first colour pictures of my later wife wearing a colourful summer dress in a meadow. It has always been my favourite photo of her. When I was off duty, usually I would walk down into Berchtesgaden. Long rambles were another way of spending time. Occasionally on Sundays I would go to Mass with a colleague. I would like to have made a regular thing of it, but going alone never appealed. Therefore, my presence at Mass depended on whether the colleague with whom I was sharing duty at the Berghof was a churchgoer or not. Incidentally, Eva often went to Mass. During the stays at the Berghof between 1940 and 1944, I repeatedly accompanied Hitler as his bodyguard on his many short rambles on the Obersalzberg. Almost every day after lunch, he would go alone or with guests to the tea house, which he had built in 1936 and 1937. It was only a 20-minute walk there, but even on fine days he would often have himself driven, mostly choosing to go in a black Volkswagen cabriolet. On my first day at the Berghof, I was somewhat put out to have a pair of leather shorts pressed into my hands. Apparently I was obliged to wear them if Hitler appeared for a ramble similarly dressed. I was very grateful that he never wore leather shorts during wartime, and so the time never came when I had to turn out in this traditional Austrian garb. In good weather, Blondie, Hitler's Alsatian bitch, would accompany her master, but only on the leash, because the countryside surrounding the Berghof was a paradise for wild animals. Blondie, by the way, had been an idea originating from within the SS bodyguard. Before Blondie, Hitler had had an almost black sheepdog called Muck. When this dog died, Hitler did not get a replacement until the old campaigners in the bodyguard decided that he had to have another. The old dog had always had a positive effect on Hitler, providing him with diversion and cheering him up. An RSD man had heard that the Alsatian bitch of Gerdy Troost, architect and wife of Speer's predecessor Paul Ludwig Troost, had had puppies in Munich. The female puppy from this brood, Blondie, so named for her very light coat, was thus visually the opposite of Muck. Hitler did not like only Alsatians. One day the small dog owned by the cook Helena Marie, Marlene von Exner, ran across his path. She had received it as a gift from her former employer, the Romanian president Ion Antonescu. Hitler kneeled beside the dog and said, "Where have you come from, you little rascal?" He then played with the joyful little animal. Eva also loved dogs. She had 2 Scotch terriers called Negus and Stasi. They were always around, yapping. The tea house was built on a small rocky plateau, which provided a glorious view over the valley. Coffee was prepared there in the tiny kitchen for guests, and a fire would be lit in the hearth in winter. Hitler never drank anything but apple or caraway tea. Indulging his passion for cakes and pastry, he never needed a coffee break. He nibbled all day long on pastries and chocolates. After stuffing himself full, he would sometimes nod off in his chair, but on days when many guests arrived, he would always be on top form, in high spirits and talkative. For the SS bodyguard, there was a special duty room at the tea house. In the late evenings, the cinema show would begin, presented by Erich Stein or his colleague Ellerbeck. Hitler was a great film fan. Often he would sit watching one film after another. Stein had to organize a constant supply from the propaganda ministry or the Reich Film Archive. Mostly they were US productions. Stein was also responsible for providing the films Hitler watched in the music room at the Reich Chancellery. I watched these films from the perspective of Stein or Ellerbeck, more out of boredom than anything. As the presentation took place in the large hall at the Berghof, the SS bodyguard made up the viewing public. The projector was near the external staircase, and I usually sat on the steps. Hitler loved Charlie Chaplin films. Unfortunately, I cannot remember which ones he ordered, nor if the anti-Hitler satire Der große Diktator, the Great Dictator, was among them. I recall especially that we watched Vom Winde verweht, Gone with the Wind, at least 3 times. After seeing this epic for the first time, Hitler sent for Goebbels at once, and they sat watching the whole film over again. "Something like that," he said afterwards to Goebbels emphatically. "Something like that might bring our people round again." Eva. I noticed the presence of Eva Braun more frequently in the summer of 1940. My first personal contact with her was in the Munich house on Wasserburger Strasse. I had to bring her something, and she detained me in conversation. Pleasantries, obviously, but she was not supposed to go even that far. We of the SS bodyguard never began a conversation. If we were asked something, we answered. Otherwise, we said only what was absolutely necessary. Officially, Eva had been introduced as the female housekeeper. The arrangement of the rooms in the Reich Chancellery and at the Berghof told another story. We were supposed to address Eva Braun as Gnädiges Fräulein, Madam, but nobody ever did. She was simply Fräulein Braun. And she thoroughly approved. Eva did not correspond to the ideal of a German maiden, as one might perhaps have expected. A natural girl, a girl rooted to the soil, this was not her thing. She changed her attire several times a day, was always carefully made up, and wore expensive jewellery. I never saw any intimacies between Hitler and Eva, and neither did my colleagues, or at least nobody spoke of them if they did. I would also have kept silent had I seen anything of that kind. As far as I could make out, they certainly never rang each other daily when Eva was at the Berghof and Hitler was in Berlin. If Eva rang to speak to Hitler, the telephonist at the far end putting her through would merely say, "The Berghof for the suite." Then one would know. Fairly soon after my new duties began, I had an unusual encounter with Eva. One morning, still quite early, just after beginning duty, I went into Hitler's suite in the old Chancellery, as I did so often, in order to leave reports on the small stool outside his bedroom. The flow of reports obviously did not come to a stop at night, and so our duties continued all around the clock. If the servants and adjutants were still asleep, we brought the dispatches immediately from the bodyguard quarter and directly to Hitler without the usual detours. One could reach his bedroom from the study or the guest room. Both, therefore, always had a small stool for dispatches. From the stairs, the route through the guest room was somewhat shorter than through the study, so it was my custom to deposit the dispatches on the stool in the guest area. Therefore, I opened the door, took a couple of steps inside, and just as I was putting the batch of papers down, I noticed that the guest bed was occupied. In shock, I recognized Eva Braun, wearing only a very flimsy nightie. I went hot and cold. Eva had already seen me, therefore our eyes met. She said nothing, but merely raised her right forefinger to her closed lips. I turned away at once and crept off to the nearby study, heart beating furiously, deposited the paperwork on the stool there and made myself scarce. Well, that's the end of my service with the Führer, I thought immediately. But why hadn't she shut the damned door? I was also furious with my colleagues. None of them had warned me when I began my shift that Eva had arrived. Over the next few weeks I expected every day to have to face the consequences. Nothing ever came of it. In the autumn of 1940, Hitler began shuttling between Berlin and Berchtesgaden. That October, after a fleeting stay at my fiancé's house, I was at the Berghof again. At the end of that month, Hitler left the Obersalzberg for a meeting with General Franco on the Franco-Spanish border. Scarcely had Hitler driven off than Eva took control. She was a woman of two quite distinct personalities. In Hitler's presence, she was reserved. At state functions, she retired to her room or went down to the bowling alley in the cellar. She would make small talk, maintaining a good atmosphere and trying to please everybody. Once Hitler left the Berghof, Eva changed at once. While one could still see the limousines driving down the serpentine road below, the first preparations for much entertainment would already have been taken in hand. Still as virtuous as a governess, she turned everything on its head, and then she would be gay and carefree, almost childlike. On that October day, when Hitler set off for southwest France, only Karl Tenazek and I of the bodyguard had remained behind. Soon afterwards, Eva appeared and invited us to join the others in the great living room. The girls needed dancing partners. Hesitant and uncertain, Karl and I followed her. In a flash she had organised a party foxtrot music and a small buffet. We nibbled on the sly and talked. "You have to enjoy yourselves," Eva urged us both continually. "You have to dance." Eva was aiming to fix me up with one of the house employees called Gretel. "You would be a lovely couple," she giggled like a silly teenage girl. Relationships between the female employees at the Berghof and the SS bodyguard were common. Some time or other, the last housemaid had netted herself a bodyguard, it appeared. Among those who, like myself, were already attached, not all could resist a flirtation with one of the girls from the Berghof or Berchtesgaden. Many of the men had been away from home for a long time. I was lucky enough to be able to see Gerda regularly during my stays in Berlin. This Gretel, whom Eva continually manoeuvred into my proximity, was the bar girl at the Berghof. At receptions and festivities, she supplied the alcohol, mixed wonderful cocktails, and supervised the drinks. That made her interesting, of course. Even when Hitler was there, Eva would often invite her friends Hertha Schneider, 18, or the Austrian girl Marion Schönmann, 18, to visit. Because of Eva, the atmosphere at the Berghof was above all unforced, almost cheerful. One thing was taboo for me, however. I never danced with Eva. That really was not done. She was the Führer's girl. Eva had a zest for living almost until the end. I liked her. Molotov's bunker. After the meeting with Franco, and contrary to expectations, Hitler did not return to the Berghof. Karl and I were therefore flown back to Berlin, where we awaited the visit of the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov 21 in mid-November. I was on duty when Hitler and Molotov dined at the Reich Chancellery. The Soviet Foreign Minister decided to return to the Schloss Bellevue guest house afterwards, and I brought a blanket to the limousine, which he had requested for his legs. It was a bitterly cold night. Back at the Reich Chancellery, I went to the smoking room in which the other diners had gathered. My duty post was the telephone. Everybody was talking about Molotov, but I heard none of it because telephone reports were coming in constantly. Finally, I was told an Allied aircraft had been identified over Lüneburg, heading on a southeasterly course, and therefore towards Berlin. I reported it at once to the Chief of Protocol, Alexander Freiherr von Dornberg, who was standing close by me. Hitler was not far away and asked at once what the problem was. When Dornberg explained the situation, the Foreign Ministry liaison officer to Hitler, Hewell, asked, "What should we do about Molotov? If that aircraft is actually heading for Berlin, we should bring him at once to Hotel Adlon." "Why there?" Hitler asked in irritation. "Because Hotel Adlon has a bomb-proof bunker." This kindled a discussion about secure bunker installations below the Reich Chancellery. It had an air raid cellar, which many called a bunker, but it would not survive a direct hit. Accordingly, that same evening, Hitler decided to build a bunker there. It is high time that the head of state of the German Reich is also in a position to offer his guests at least as safe a place to shelter as Hotel Adlon. Construction work on the bunker was held back, however, and not until 1943 was it begun. In the centre of the Reich Chancellery garden, a giant hole was suddenly dug. "Wonderful, now we're going to have a swimming pool," my colleagues joked. The bunker was never fully finished. To the very end, which would concentrate my duties, the Third Reich and Hitler precisely into that very place. The subterranean labyrinth never really dried out. The ban on Hess flying. Shortly after the visit of the Soviet foreign minister in November 1940, I was again with Hitler on the Obersalzberg, this time only for a few days. One evening, one of the adjutants asked us to prepare a place for another guest at dinner. Hitler liked to eat in company at the Berghof, and as often happened, he gave us very little notice of his dinner guests. A colleague knew that Hess was staying in his house on the Obersalzberg, and I reached him by telephone. He was free that evening and set off for the Berghof straight away. Towards the end of the meal, a courier arrived and handed a dispatch to Reich Press Chief Otto Dietrich. He ran his eye over it quickly and then passed it to Hitler, who read it standing up and then exclaimed, "My God, what am I supposed to do? I can't fly there and beg on my knees." I didn't know the background, but as the talk subsequently increased in volume, I picked up a few scraps. I understood that the discussion was all about a meeting in Portugal between the military attaché Enno Emil von Rintelen, whom we called Hitler's postman, and his Swedish colleague Graf Bernadotte. The exact purpose or the aim of the whole thing was not revealed to me. Only later did I hear the rumours of secret negotiations with the British. What I do remember, however, was that Hess, answering Hitler's earlier observation, not to him but to his adjutant, uttered something like, "Perhaps he can't, but I can." Hess excused himself relatively soon after this incident and took his leave. I was on very good terms with Josef Sepp Platzer, Hess's servant, and when we were in Soviet captivity together much later, he took the opportunity to give me a full report on what happened next during that evening and how things panned out. Sepp drove back with Hess to his house, and in the car he repeated that sentence. "Hitler cannot, but I can." Then he let Sepp into his plan. He had decided to fly to Britain on his own account. Nobody else was to know, at first, not even his own adjutants. First of all, Sepp had to obtain 2 British history books. Above all, however, Hess had to have knowledge about the flight safety zones, especially the code words, which were changed daily, so as to find the dead zones and avoid coming under friendly flak fire. Sepp mentioned to Flugkapitän Bauer the map with the safety zones marked out on it. At first, Bauer declined the request. Sepp insisted, "You know my boss, he wants to be informed about everything." Bauer then personally obtained a copy from Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, on the pretext that the map was needed by his deputy, Hitler's second pilot, Georg Betz. After this had been achieved, Hess needed a place to which he could withdraw and prepare for his operation. He got his servant to ask a Gauleiter to put a farmstead in Austria at his disposal. At that point, Hess had never made a parachute jump. Sepp got him some special beginner's boots and bandages used by paratroopers at the start of their training. Hess stuck the map on the wall of his hut in the Austrian mountains and studied it lying in bed. Sepp had seen that for himself. Hess incessantly flew an Me-110 fighter bomber. He even made some courier flights. One day when he met Hitler in Berlin, I was on duty. Hitler looked at him in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Hess requested to familiarize himself officially with courier flights, but Hitler refused and forbade Hess as well as Goering as his deputies, Hess as deputy party chairman, Goering as Reich Chancellor, from flying altogether. Obviously, neither took any notice. In February 1941, Hess took off on his first British flight attempt. Sepp advised him that at all costs he must wear uniform. As a civilian, the British would put him before a firing squad. They were very strict about it. Shortly before getting into the Messerschmitt aircraft, Hess gave to his adjutants Karl-Heinz Pinch and Alfred Leitgen an envelope, with strict instructions that it was only to be opened if he did not return within 20 minutes. Hess had hardly gone off to the aircraft when the two adjutants became anxious and tore open the envelope. Inside the outer envelope was another addressed to Hitler. It was marked very urgent. Before the adjutants could decide what to do next, Hess came back after only 7 minutes. He had in fact taken off, but landed again immediately. He spoke briefly with the flight engineer Neumeier, who also, under the greatest secrecy regarding the mission, had placed explosives and additional fuel tanks in the aircraft, and then got back in the car with Sepp, the adjutants and the driver Rudi, and drove back to Munich. Nobody knows whether there was really a technical problem with the aircraft, or if Hess suddenly lost courage. Sepp and I thought the latter, because Hess had trained incessantly on the plane, and a defect at this stage was unlikely. The adjutants finally found their tongues, and admitted to Hess that they had opened the letter prematurely. They therefore knew that their boss was planning something that made it urgent for them to inform Hitler of the fact once Hess had flown off. At first Hess was silent. Sepp tried to clarify the situation and give his superior the opportunity to decide on how to proceed. As they drove through a stretch of woodland, Sepp therefore suggested that Hess might like to take a walk, since he liked walking through woods so much. "Platzer thinks I should take a little walk." "Good, I'll walk." Hess told Rudi to stop the car, and he spent half an hour walking round. Back in the limousine, he then addressed his adjutants. They now knew something that they had to keep secret under all circumstances. The events to which they had just been witness had never taken place. Everybody held firm to that. In February 1941, Hess made another attempt, but abandoned it without having taken off this time. It would be May before the third attempt was made, and this time he went. In the spring of 1941, Hitler made many trips. I did not always accompany him. It was the time of the Balkans campaign. In the Reich Chancellery there were often very important visitors. Above all, the Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka was received with special honours. The Japanese always brought the strangest gifts with them. I remember a very old sea chart according to which one could walk to Great Britain from the European continent without ever getting one's feet wet. If there was a state banquet, then Herr Lange, the kitchen chef of the Führer suite, did not cook. Instead, the chief chef of the Kaiserhof Hotel was used. He was called Weigert or Weigelt. I do not remember exactly. Even the waiters came from the Kaiserhof. They were men of long service who had once been employed by Kaiser Wilhelm, all imposing figures, tall and well turned out. Not Nazis, but German nationalists. These waiters had wardrobes in the cellar of the Reich Chancellery, in which their extremely elegant work attire was hung, including strap shoes. Before festivities, they changed there. These waiters were also employed at Schloss Klesheim. At the beginning of April, I accompanied Hitler for the first time in his special train, named America. Later, from the 1st of February 1943, it was renamed Brandenburg, but none of us could get used to the change, and we continued to refer to it as America among ourselves. The special train was a fully functioning Führer HQ on wheels. It was kept at the ready at the Berlin-Anhalter station, in a shed near Bautzener Strasse and Yorkstrasse, and was taken from there to the best-positioned railway station for where Hitler wanted to travel in it. Later it stood at FHQ Wolfschanze in East Prussia. The special train was drawn by 2 locomotives and consisted of a flak wagon, luggage wagon, work coach and domestic coach for Hitler, Then came our coach with the bodyguard and a dining car mostly used as an officer's mess. Coupled up behind these was the Wehrmacht coach as well as others for the female secretaries, which I never entered. The windows were, for the most part, darkened. The refurbished train was luxurious throughout, the individual coaches having washrooms with hot and cold water and a telephone connection between coaches. I had a compartment to myself alone. Situation conferences were held in the conference coach, which had a large wooden table in the centre. The Führer coach, which incidentally I never visited, was used occasionally for small-scale conferences. Once, when I was leaning casually at a window, somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I turned round. It was Hitler who wanted to get by. In such situations it was not necessary to say anything. The train was a very sociable place. Now and again Hitler would sit diagonally facing me in the officers' mess coach, drinking his Holzkirchner beer. The firm Mitropa ran the dining car. Mitropa offered the most carefully selected culinary specialities, a land of milk and honey. It was here on the train that I saw Hitler eat meat for the only time in the 5 years I was with him. The Mitropa also provided other riches, those to make the heart of a lady beat faster, perfume, stockings, handkerchiefs from Paris and other such things. Once, directly after a night shift, I had to take a train from Berlin to Berchtesgaden. On the way I fell into conversation with a young lady who lent me a book called Gedanken nach 2 Uhr nachts, Thoughts After 2 in the Morning, by Aribert Wascher for the long journey. When she was preparing to alight, I attempted to return the book to her, but she told me to hold on to it until I had finished it. I insisted that at least she give me an address to where I could send the book. She fished out a scrap of paper and wrote her name and address on it. I did not look at it until she had left the train, and was irritated to find that both the name and address were almost illegible. I thought that might have been because of the motion of the train. Ursula Ruben? Robin? Well, I thought, my RSD colleagues could help out here, and I gave them the task of finding the lady, which they did and where she lived. This turned out to be at Lubben in Brandenburg, just where she had got out. I bought her a gift from Mitropa and also sent a telegram worded, "Thoughts after 2 in the morning to follow." The man in the telegraph office smirked when he read this ambiguous greeting. We still had no suspicion that the invasion of the Soviet Union was now imminent. In April 1941, the special train brought us to near Vienna, in a more or less improvised Führer HQ train christened Frühlingssturm, Spring Storm. It was stationed at a tunnel entrance near Monichkirchen. If there was an aircraft alarm, the train pulled back into the tunnel. Train travel was not the quickest way of moving around the country. In order not to interfere with the regular Reichsbahn timetables and to avoid being noticed, the journey would be interrupted frequently. The Reichsbahn had priority. We often went down lesser-used tracks. Sometimes we would be stuck for ages in some siding, such as on the way to Monichkirchen, when we had a very long wait near Hof. On the 20th of April 1941, Hitler celebrated his 52nd birthday in FHQ Frühlingssturm. As it happened, I had taken the plane back to Berlin shortly before this. Hitler did not then arrive back in the Reich capital until the end of April. After Hitler had addressed the Reichstag at the beginning of May 1941, he returned to the Berghof. At that time there now occurred the flight to Britain by Hesse, for which he had been preparing for so long. On the evening of the 10th of May 1941, his plane left the runway at the Messerschmitt Works, Augsburg. This time everything aboard the Me-110 was in order, and probably he had worked up the necessary courage. The 20 minutes deadline, during which period he had told his adjutants to stand by and wait before they did anything else, passed without any sign of his returning. Karl-Heinz Pinch, as arranged, presented himself at the Berghof next morning to hand the prepared letter to Hitler. Hitler was outraged. Hesse? Hesse? Hesse of all people did that? Hesse of all people? Why did he do that to me? Hitler did not tire of repeating himself. For the next 3 days, 11th to 13th of May, Hitler absented himself from the military situation conferences and confined himself to his room on the first floor. The generals came to the situation conferences and withdrew without being able to report anything. Even Goebbels was only received upstairs in Hitler's room when he arrived on the 12th of May. The official line later was that Hess had acted as the result of mental derangement. A communiqué to that effect was worked on with Dietrich. Hess wanted to see the Duke of Hamilton in order to conduct his own private peace talks with the British. The Duke was apparently close to Churchill. We of the SS bodyguard got quickly to the crux of the matter. Had Hess really acted off his own bat? We were agreed that Hitler would have needed to be a good actor to fake the indignation and upset he had displayed when reading Hess's letter. At any rate, after what I saw in November 1940, there must have been complete accord between Hess and Hitler, at least with regard to the aim of his undertaking. We were well aware, of course, that one of Hitler's utopian ideas was of fighting shoulder to shoulder with the highly esteemed British against Bolshevism. The party leadership had to be passed to somebody else, and Hitler then appointed Martin Bormann as chief of the party chancellery. In this, Hitler chose the wrong man, in our opinion. Goebbels in, Bormann out, we said. We might have admitted that Martin Bormann's contacts with us were conciliatory to some extent, but nobody had a soft spot for him. Even his own brother did not exist for him, after Albert Bormann had married a woman completely unacceptable in Martin's eyes. Goebbels we liked. He was usually cheerful and was man enough to contradict Hitler, even if only to turn down a dinner invitation. That impressed us. Meanwhile, Bormann always fawned on Hitler. Certainly almost everyone did, but Bormann was the champion at it. He was always scheming how to improve his position. Most of the time he was involved in intrigues and power play. This won him no friends. Only Hitler's old party comrades would dare to say something about it openly, particularly August Korber. Later, Korber even tried to describe to Hitler the true situation at the front after he had been there himself. Hitler did not take his criticisms the wrong way, but they didn't count for anything with him. That may seem to be the case for you. What his old comrade had told him was worth no more than that. At Bormann's insistence, everybody who had had knowledge of Hess's flight to Britain was arrested and taken to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. This included Hess's two adjutants, the mechanic Neumeier, and also my friend Sepp Platzer. Afterwards, Sepp served at the front and, as previously described, was made a POW by the Soviets. After the uproar caused by Hess, towards the end of May, another piece of bad news was received at the Berghof. The Bismarck, the most powerful battleship in the world, had been sunk by British naval forces while aiming to reach the occupied port of Saint-Nazaire. This was the first major loss on the German side. Chapter 7. FHQ. Wolfschanze, 1941. On the afternoon of the 22nd of June 1941, as Operation Barbarossa began, Hitler left Berlin. Initially, he went into the newly built FHQ Wolfschanze, about 10 kilometers east of the East Prussian town of Rastenburg. The barrack camp had been built by the organization Todt. It had bomb-proof bunkers, and the whole installation was covered with camouflage netting so that the bunkers, paths, and structures could not be seen from the air. Meanwhile, work continued on other security measures and extensions. FHQ Wolfschanze was equipped with fully functioning logistics. Hitler could direct the state, party, and war from there. There was a daily courier service from there to the presidential chancellery in Berlin. OKH, Army High Command, was located near Angerburg, about 25 kilometers from FHQ Wolfschanze. OKH representatives came twice daily for the military situation conferences, mostly by train, in an old railway coach, which stopped at the purpose-built Bahnhof Görlitz within the security confines of the Führer HQ. FHQ Wolfschanze had its own railway track and an enormous platform to receive official state visits. FHQ Wolfschanze was within 2 Sperrkreise, protected areas. All kinds of special passes existed, which gave limited entry here or there. The password was changed daily. The pass with the most extensive permission had a red diagonal stripe and allowed access to Sperrkreis 1, the Führer Sperrkreis. None of this applied to us of the bodyguard. We had our open sesame, which I have mentioned before, and it lived up to its name, even in the FHQ Wolfschanze. Whereas the OKH headquarters, known as Mauerwald because of its location on the Mauer Lake, offered 1,500 generals, officers and men a bed and shelter, and was accordingly the size of a small town. FHQ Wolfschanze was extremely modest, both in size and its accommodation. We in the bodyguard were given quarters in wooden barracks within the inner Sperrkreis. As time went on, the wooden walls were reinforced with concrete. Our barrack hut was the only place where one could enter the Führer Sperrkreis uncontrolled. The barrack hut straddled Sperrkreis II and Sperrkreis I. Hitler's bunker was basically built around his office. There was a bedroom and washroom, and a very small living room equipped with a table and some chairs. Bormann, after his appointment as chief of the party chancellery, and naturally as befitted his more important status, had his quarters opposite those of Hitler. Goering lived near the railway line, while Himmler's own field command post was about half an hour away, and was called Hochwald, high woodland, corresponding to the scenery. We spent the longest period of the war with Hitler at FHQ Wolfschanze. The first days in that summer of 1941 were almost perfect. The reports from the Eastern Front were excellent, and everybody was in the best of spirits. At first I had nothing to do. The Wehrmacht handled the telephone service, my colleague Helmuth Biermann was given responsibility for the mail and courier services, and the RSD escorted the guests. My work was limited to being within range of Hitler for possible assignments. Nothing exciting happened, and the mood became generally more informal. To put it another way, we lazed around. Soon we sought to overcome our boredom by swimming in the nearby Moisy Lake.